Hello, I'm Char. I'm a teacher, an administrator, and an education leader, and I live in the US. And I am here today with my colleague, Laura, who is from Cape Town, South Africa. And we are going to spend the next 30 minutes sharing what we want to show you at the intersection of ideas and experience. We've realized that despite our very different backgrounds, locations, and experiences, we have a lot of commonalities that we did not expect. So we thought that you might have some as well, and we'd like to share ours with you. And today we're going to be talking about upskilling. I think that's such a trendy new word, Laura, the idea of upskilling. It's not something that we talked about 10 years ago. You know, we talked about career ready or future ready, but this whole idea of upskilling is something that's kind of new.
I think it came in along with agility and, you know, just in time, although just in time in production isn't new. It really is in education and in corporate learning and so on, and especially in upskilling. So it all came in together, I think, as people realized the world was changing more rapidly than it ever has before. And honestly, you go to university and you learn how to do a certain thing, and 10 years from now, you're not using anything anymore because everything has just changed so much. You've had to upskill. And it is a trendy word, but people are very seldom actually interrogate what it actually means and what it means for us in our daily lives as well. You know, like we're expected to go to work, which is fine. But then we also, I had somebody say once, you know, you go to work for 8 hours, you sleep for 8 hours, that leaves another 8 hours to upskill. It doesn't, because those other 8 hours are spent doing mundane things, you know, cooking dinner, maybe spending time with your family, taking a shower, for crying out loud,
Right,
you know,
right.
eating your lunch, a little bit of relaxation, playing with your cat, taking your dog for a walk. There isn't, and when you're done with all of those things, they seem like small things, but they add up, and there just isn't time. And so a lot of companies expect their people to upskill outside of working hours, which just isn't realistic. I don't know what you think.
You know, I what you said about there just isn't time for upskilling. You know, I think that's what we're hearing, at least what I'm hearing. So much of my work now is supporting educators and administrators and education leaders and people who work with education leaders. And I hear that from all of them. Like, there's so much out there in terms of what we need to be able to do now to support students who we know are going to go out into a world where they're going to almost be constantly upskilling. And what I hear from everybody is like, we just don't have time. You know, I work all day, I'm in my classroom, or I'm in my building, or I'm in all these meetings. And by the time I get home at 6 o'clock, the thought of reading a new article or watching a YouTube video about how to do something new, like my brain just doesn't have the capacity to absorb that. So I think figuring out how do you constantly upskill yourself in tiny little doses, like small little micro upskillings versus having to absorb massive change. I think that if we could figure that out, I think we would be in hot demand, because short of taking complete time off from your current work to prepare to do new work, it's so hard to find the just right amount of knowledge you need to upskill yourself, or even what that looks like.
I was chatting to some people from the education department a while ago. They wanted advice on how their teachers could use AI to upskill themselves in, you know, to teach technological subjects. And they were all really excited about the possibilities. But then I posed the question, when would they learn this? And they didn't know. So then I proposed, that AI would be able to help them save time on other things they would normally be doing, like creating a lesson plan, for example. But the thing is, even if you regain that time, it's going to be very difficult to use it to upskill instead of, and as important as upskilling is, it's going to be very difficult to motivate yourself to do that instead of spending another hour with your kids or your cats or your Netflix even, because I mean, unwinding and doing nothing and switching your brain off is as important as anything else. Otherwise you don't sleep. Well, for me anyway, I need to unwind and do something less demanding than my work. That's, I think, the problem with knowledge work. If you do a certain kind of job, you can go home and learn about things. But if your whole day is spent doing heavy mental work, it's a lot more difficult. I mean, I'm thinking back, okay, I was in my 20s, granted, but I was studying and working at the same time. So I was working to fund my studies, but I wasn't doing knowledge work in the beginning anyway.
Right.
And then it was fine. I could go home and study. Like I said, granted, I was in my 20s, so I just had a lot more energy, but it's unthinkable to me to think all day at work. And then luckily my job is something where I have to upskill in the course of my work. It's not something separate I have to do. It fits into my work.
So let's think on that for a minute, because being an educator or working in education just in general is definitely knowledge work. And when I think back on my career, I started as an educator when I was 21. And even when you're not in the classroom, like I've always talked about, you see things through teacher eyes. Like my brain is always looking at, how could that be a learning opportunity? How could I pull that idea into my classroom? How would my kids benefit if I could show them this? Oh, that's a really interesting thing. Where would that connection lie? Like, so your brain, you're right when you're saying when you do knowledge work, your brain not only is having to make decisions and evaluate and analyze and implement and create throughout the day of your job, but it's really difficult to get your brain to not do that when you get home. Yeah. And so what you said about upskilling while you're doing your job, what does that look like for you? Give me some examples, because I think from my perspective, that's really what I'm hoping to support educators in doing now in my new role, is not that they need to find more time or that they're going to use AI to be more efficient so that they have X amount of more time, but how do you actually upscale while you're doing your job when you have humans in front of you that are also upskilling themselves? Like, what does that look like for you? Talk to me about that.
So I'm in instructional design, right? And for every project, I have people wanting certain outcomes, and I'm not talking about learning outcomes now, I'm talking about outcomes. So my output, and they want fresh, they want new, they want exciting, they want cutting edge. So it's tiny little incremental things that I have to learn all the time to satisfy the clients. So for example, I had a client recently who wanted a proposal for a micro learning course that would not take the learners or the users away from their job. And they wanted, funny enough, upskilling integrated into their daily life. So I had to figure out how to do that and yet present micro learning that would take no more than 5 to 10 minutes a day and embed behaviors and habits in that in that time. So that required me to think more creatively and to leverage the technology that I have access to and the tools that I have access to. So I had to, for example, go and research a microlearning tool that is optimized for microlearning. And that led me to certain innovations and ideas that I hadn't had before. So that's what I'm saying, it's in the course of my work, because it's in the service of a particular project that I learn different things. There are, of course, things that I learn outside of my job just by virtue of being active on LinkedIn and reading articles and so on. But that's what I do out of choice, not because I have to upskill. And then what is also useful is collaborating with other people who do those little things. And then you get this melting pot where you know this thing and I know that thing and we fit them together. And that's also what I've really found extremely helpful about generative AI, is I can ask it a targeted question and it can actually guide me. Even if it doesn't give me the answer, it can guide me to the right questions to ask. And so I'm being upskilled by virtue of the fact that I'm doing my job. I mean, there is also training, but, and as you said, I'm so grateful for that, because as you said, when I was teaching as well, it was impossible for me to not think about those things when I came home. You know, I would be sitting, eating dinner, and suddenly I would think, you know what, I realize now that if I change this assessment, and then I can actually test their understanding and put less focus on rote learning. Okay, I'm going to go write that down before I forget.
Right.
And there's your evening.
Well, when you were talking about outcome-based thinking, and that while you were looking at the outcomes of your clients, you were doing some creative thinking and some little research on your own to find a tool that might work for the idea that you had, or to do the micro learning, or thinking differently, or thinking outside the box, and then having either AI to ask you questions to kind of guide that inquiry, because it's really, upskilling is almost an inquiry activity. And that made me think about the work that I did last week around questioning and purposes for questioning and being intentional about questioning. It's like, maybe that's part of this puzzle, right? That questioning and asking the right kinds of questions at the right time actually lead to upskilling. Because if you're questioning why am I doing it this way? Or is there a different way to do that? Or how come this is happening? Or I'm noticing this change. Why is that change occurring? Or I see this in the data. I'm wondering what this is a result of. Going out and finding the answers to those questions, whether you're working collaboratively and getting other people's input. And I think being in a collaborative environment does help with upskilling. But I think going out and finding answers to those questions actually leads to upskilling, because those answers are adding to your knowledge base. They're giving you new ideas. They're helping you to make connections where you didn't see a connection before. And maybe that's what small scale upskilling really looks like, at least as a starting point, because I think large scale upskilling, if large scale is, I'm making a complete change in my job world and I'm going to be doing something completely different than what I've ever done before. And so I need to go to some very intentional training and very intentional learning to build those skills so I can do this completely different job. I think that's like large scale upskilling. Versus job embedded day-to-day is more making new connections, adding to your knowledge base, networking with people who have different experiences and ideas to build your own skill set or increase your own skill set, so that when you are given a challenge or a new outcome, you have a broader set of things to start with.
Yeah, I think that's really important because I was collaborating with a colleague today, and she knows a lot more about certain applications than I do, but then I know about and we were brainstorming to try and find a solution to a particular problem. And she knows a lot more about certain applications that I know very little about, and I know more about others that she doesn't know so much about. And we eventually actually came up with quite a few ideas. You know, she's got this totally diverse experience to me. Divergent rather, diverse is something else. So often misused, I've started misusing it myself. So her experience diverges from mine wildly, but together we actually had this incredibly fruitful session. And I think that is so important. People often talk about diverse perspectives and the value of diversity, but very few people actually believe it until you see it in action.
Or seek it out. You know,
Yes.
I think in the global world of education, divergent thinking amongst colleagues isn't always something that you look for. You know, when you hear people say, well, I would rather just go into my classroom and close the door and do it my own way, or this is my building, I know what's going on in my building, versus I really want to go watch what's going on in your classroom, even though you teach a different grade level and a different content area. We're still both educators together. And I'm really interested in how you approach, you know, questioning in your classroom or research in your classroom or just engaging students in your classroom, or like, I think seeking out that divergent thinking and listening and exploring it versus doing a comparison and saying, well, it's not what I like, it's not what I've done, so I'm not interested in that. I do think that that whole idea of divergent perspectives in a collaborative team results in so many more opportunities or new ideas, which goes back to that whole idea of upskilling. Like maybe as a group, then you all decide based on everything we've talked about, we're all going to learn this new thing together, or we're all going to try this new thing together and give each other feedback on it so that we can grow our own skills. I like that idea of divergent thinking as part of upskilling.
But you know, it's so hard, especially you find a lot of schools that are very stuck in the way they do things. I had a teacher in high school. I wasn't at an English speaking school. And he was an English teacher. And he used to encourage us. I mean, he didn't teach us any grammar, just to be sure. But I speak English, but there were children who don't. There were a lot of students who don't speak English or who didn't speak English. And he would encourage us to just have conversations and to talk about something we cared about. You know, so we had rearing debates about feminism and capitalism. And, you know, it was amazing. And he got us to think and to debate. And we could talk about anything as long as we did it in English and as long as it wasn't, you know, abusive in any way. And he actually was fired. And the fact is that after that happened, he told us, look, he's been dismissed, he'll be leaving. And this was still back in the day of faxes, and the parents said that their children's English has improved so much that they faxed the school and they broke the school's fax machine with all the messages from the parents telling them, like, our children's education has improved this much. And I feel that's the kind of thing you need. He was thinking outside of the box of regular education. And now with AI and all of those things, teachers are going to need to think outside the box. They can't just put their heads in the sand and keep doing what they've been doing. Because, I mean, as incredible as a good teacher is, as transformative as a good teacher can be in the life of a student. And I've had some incredible teachers who changed my life, and where I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for some of them. A teacher who refuses to respond to the challenges and the environment, and refuses to respond to the progress or advancement, whatever you think about progress or advancement aside, is not doing children a service and could really actually be holding them back in the end.
And I think when I look at that, if you stay in your, if you're not interested in upskilling yourself daily, like small opportunities to upskill yourself, little incremental things, then you're also not modeling that for the students that you're working with. And so much of the research around what authentic, contextualized, real world, connect to the kids' interests and passions education, like how important that is. So if you, as the lead educator or someone who's leading educators, isn't able to see those things and continually question, why is it that we continue to do it this way? What are students really interested in? What is going on in the world? How am I finding out what's going on in the world? Who have I included in my network who has broader perspectives or different experiences that can help influence what is going to be the experience for the students in our school or in our classroom? Or for our parents, because, I think parents are also kind of caught up in this need to upskill as well. When I look at what's happening in the job market and what I know is going to happen in the job market as a result of continued tech advances and shifts in climate and changes in what the economy is valuing, I think that parents are also going to need to upskill and have new experiences and have networking and connections. And, I've always liked the idea that a school is part of a larger community, that it shouldn't be isolated from the community, that it should actually be kind of at the core of your community. And it's not just the students whose needs are being met, who are the community's needs being met within the school, and how are the parents, like what can schools offer parents beyond, you need to attend this meeting because it's required for your child to participate in this activity, versus we're really looking at our adult education offerings and partnering with universities or local businesses to expand opportunities for you, the parents and the grandparents and the aunts and uncles that live on our community, so that you can upskill too. I mean, you and I have done so much work around generative AI, and your husband Justin is doing so much work around generative AI and how it can be useful to people and efficient. It's like, we can't just be teaching that to the kids. Like, we are going to have to teach that to all the adults, the teachers and the administrators and the parents and the grandparents and the aunts and uncles and the business leaders in the community. Because the businesses who are paying attention to that and who are already incorporating AI in novel ways into their work are the businesses that are going to be pulling out in front. My husband and I had that conversation last night about just how embedded AI is becoming across all these different industries. And if you can't upskill yourself to understand how to work with it and how to work differently, then there's going to be a big skill gap coming again in our society.
I just wish we could figure out where to target, because I mean, there's a reason it's the young teachers who are innovative, right? It's not in the older teachers. It's not laziness. It's that they've been smothered by a system that just doesn't reward that kind of thinking, that, and years and years of overwork, underappreciation, and roadblocks every time they try to do something that's truly valuable, it erodes their passion. Like, I think that you were talking about a teacher's eyes, and I think that's the mark of somebody who really cares. And I think most teachers, the vast majority of teachers, start out that way, but they just can't maintain it in a school system that doesn't allow them to do what they actually signed up for, which is actually to educate. And I wish we could figure out exactly where to target that and how to target that. I've seen what good leadership versus bad leadership in a school can do. I've seen it firsthand, but there are pressures from above for everyone in the system, but you can't start with the Minister of Education, because that's not going to get you anywhere.
No, I think it almost has to happen at the same time. I think about, if you put pressure on one side, then everything just goes over to the other side. But if you can put equal pressure along it, then everything can kind of move forward, right? You're not pushing one side further and then the other side, or so.
But you'd have to time it perfectly.
So it has to happen simultaneously. Like, while you're talking with students and classroom teachers, you also have to be talking with administrators and district leaders. And you also have to be talking with people who are in the education sector, because the materials that they are creating and the opportunities they're creating, the resources that they're developing, need to match what it is you're asking teachers and students and administrators to do. So like, that's where the disconnect has happened in the past, where either people in the education sector have seen, yes, here's where it needs to go, and they've created these really innovative upskill things that, when presented to building administrators and educators, they're so far out in front of them that they can't see how they could possibly use them. Likewise, when you have sets of teachers, students, and administrators who are pushing forward and building community partnerships and school to work partnerships and STEM initiatives, and they're doing really innovative things in their classroom, they're exhausted because they have to create their own resources and materials, because the education sector has lagged behind them and isn't where they need to be. And maybe that's where generative AI can close that gap, because when you are pushing out in front and you are seeing change and innovation, it takes a lot of energy to pull in and create the things that you need to do that work. A lot of innovation comes from that. But if generative AI can help you in thinking through, how do you create that, or how do you see those connections? Likewise, the education sector that's out here and is thinking, they're so far in front of the people who would be using it. Like, generative AI can also help them in saying, all right, this is where we are, and this is where our customer base is. What are the stepping stones that need to happen to get them to make it to where we are? That's why I think putting like that, it has to happen together. I'm looking at what's happening in my own state right now around education and leadership, because the governor is looking at completely reimagining, in his view, what the state Department of Education is going to look like, and merging it into this like Department of Future Work, and education will be part of it. And so he's got an idea, and the people who are advising him have their ideas and what that vision is and what it's going to look like. But how is that connecting to businesses and innovators, how is that connecting to K-12 education in the public sector? How is that connecting to what parents and communities are seeing that they want for children? How's that connecting to what children want for children? And it's not happening simultaneously. So I think that's the challenge when you talk about upskilling. It's upskilling yourself daily in your job is far easier than upskilling yourself to make a big change, which is still far easier than looking at the larger context of changing how people are thinking or moving forward. That's the lift. And the role that AI is playing in that, I think we're starting to see. I don't think people have fully wrapped their heads around how much generative AI is going to pull everybody, like it or not, forward into this new kind of existence.
I suspect that upskilling in teaching is going to be a lot more than just the skills to use certain things. It'll also just be the upskilling yourself to reimagine how you teach and how your children learn. And you're talking about the future of work. That's not what schools are for. That's not what education is for. It's not to create workers. It's to create well-rounded human beings that can contribute to the community and contribute. And that is, I think, why it's also so important to set an example, not only to set an example, but also to upskill in things that you can then pass on. And if you can upskill yourself to have an open mind and a curiosity and a learning mindset, then I think, and you can pass that on.
Right. It goes back to asking good questions, and have that curiosity and that willingness to look at divergent thinkers and perspectives and points of view. I think that is what's going to be most important.
And if you can teach that to students, that's what'll create, I think, the world we want to see. But it remains to be seen how that's going to play out.
Well, considering we weren't sure we could talk about upskilling for 35 minutes, I think we could keep talking about it for like another 2 hours. It's certainly given me a lot to think about, because the world of education, whether you're in a college setting, a higher ed setting, or a K-12 setting, or a preschool setting, or a more informal education setting, or you're in the education sector, is essential to the ongoing success of humanity. And we need people who have the ability to be curious and look at things in a new way and communicate that to somebody else and put together a process for doing something that makes sense, that you can communicate that process to someone else, or to investigate a problem and see it through many different lenses to find a solution to that problem that uses the resources that you have available to you. I think all of those are the skills that we need to upskill around, versus, as you said, learning how to use a document camera is not necessarily upskilling yourself. Learning how to use a document camera is a way that you can communicate to other people, but starting to think about upskilling more as a life skill upskill. I'm upskilling my perspective, I'm upskilling my thinking skills, my problem solving strategies, my ability to hear other people's perspectives and do something with it. And maybe that's the level of upskilling that we really are talking about.
And it's the hardest one to do, and to encourage other people to do.
Well, we know that there is so much more to see than what we talked about today, for sure. We'd love for you to show us what you see, or use our conversation today as an opportunity to share what you see with others. Thank you for spending time with us today. Laura, thank you for bringing upskilling into our conversation. I really enjoyed talking about it with you today.
Thank you, Char. I just hope we've encouraged at least one person to upskill themselves in the way we described.